What's up, everyone? I'm James Young with James Young Photography, and this is episode number 17 of Teach Me How to Lightroom. Today we're going to really hone in on a specific subject here, and that's specifically the tone curve. I get asked a lot of questions about how to interact with the tone curve on purpose, how to know when to do matte finishes, how to know when to go into other channels, etc., etc. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. The first thing you really want to understand about the tone curve is what tones in the tonal spectrum you're interacting with at what time. So starting from all the way to the left, you start with blacks. And then as you make your way to the right, and we'll click a node there, we start getting into the shadows. As we hit the middle, very appropriately named, is the midtones. As we go a little bit further to the right, we hit our highlights. And then all the way to the right, we hit our whites. Now, depending on what you do with these various nodes that you've placed, you're going to make various adjustments to the tones at that region. For example, let's go to the second node on the left here. So this is our shadows, and if we click and drag that down, it's going to darken our shadows. Then on the flip side of that, if we go to the node opposite, which would be our highlights, and we go up, we're gonna start to raise the highlights just a little bit. And you can really see how powerful of a tool this is. We just made two very slight adjustments, and we've already pretty dramatically changed the way this looks. Watch, let's turn off the tone curve and turn it back on. That's a huge change for such a small amount of movement. Now, the cool thing about working with the tone curve, especially in Lightroom, it's completely non-destructive. And what that means is all of the changes you can do are just like the sliders here. So if you do something really extreme, you can just completely undo it or put it to a more appropriate spot. So let's go back in the tone curve and let's remove those nodes and then put them back. And you can see we're kind of back to square one. Now, when I'm doing my edits, the first place I like to start with is the tone curve when I start making my first batch of initial changes. And you can see this label here, point curve, and right now it's set to custom because we have made a couple adjustments here. Let's click where it says custom, and it's actually a drop-down list, and you can select linear, and this is basically what you get when you import your picture. This is like the absolute vanilla tone curve. Nothing's changed here. But again, where I like to start is with medium contrast, or if I'm doing a black and white edit, a lot of times I'll go with strong contrast. But for me as a portrait photographer, I start with medium because too much contrast, especially on the face and on skin and things like that, can look pretty unsightly for portraits. But hey, that's just my opinion. You can crank up whatever contrast you want. So now that we have our medium contrast applied, let's check out what the different channels do. So next to the label channel, by default, you're put at RGB, and that's just your entire red, green, blue color spectrum. But what's cool about the tone curve is that you can actually hone into the specific channel that you want, and all of the same rules apply. So check this out. You can create a node for the midtones, the highlights, the shadows, and the blacks and whites already exist. And you can go through and modify the tone curve specific to that tonal range. So if you do something like this, you'll notice because there is a lot of red in the background, specifically in the shadows, as you can see here, it's really dampened the reds in the shadows here, and in turn brought out a lot of the green. So let's undo that, put the slider back there. And conversely, if we do a similar thing on the highlights, you can see what it does in real time. So let's remove that node and go to another channel. And you can see here, it will do the same exact thing. So you can see how this can be a very, very powerful tool. So let's go into the blues. Now the blue channel is a pretty cool one because when you're doing cinematic color grading, a lot of times folks like to add blue into the shadows, especially here in the split toning. So to the right of shadows, I can press the rectangle and just click somewhere within the colder tones, and you can see you're adding blue to the shadows, right? Just depending on how much saturation you add more blue to more shadows. All right, perfect. But you can also do something similar directly into the tone curve, specifically in the blue channel. For example, if I put a node in the midtones and I put a node right in the shadows, and I click and drag that node up, you're gonna see in real time here, blue getting injected into the shadows through the tone curve. Now, of course, in this example, everything's going to the extreme, and this isn't necessarily how you would normally use it, but we go to these extreme lengths here so that you can see exactly what it does while you're using it. So let's undo that, and make our way back to the RGB side. So let's take a look at a finalized edit and take a look at what we did with the tone curve specifically within that edit. Okay, so we have this final edit here, and you can see a lot of color grading took place within this edit. As I scroll down, you can see all kinds of adjustments were made, split toning was done. So this is really quite an extreme edit. And again, the color grading that took place here, this is not meant to look realistic. This is meant to have sort of a cinematic quality to it. But let's take a look at what the tone curve looks like. And you can see here we have that S curve that we normally do, but on the very, very left, you can see that the shadows were raised. So the overall tonal quality within the blacks has been raised, and you can also see that within the histogram that we've raised the total value for the blacks. And then we've done the same thing on the highlights here and brought the highlights down just a little bit, all the way on the extreme side on the whites. But check out what else we did here within the channels. Our reds, our total reds in the shadows were raised. And we can raise them even further here and see as that effect gets more and more dramatic what it does. So let's undo that, keep it subtle where it was at. In the greens, a similar thing was done. And look, we're only raising this 3%. Okay, this is meant to be very subtle. Don't be the person that does this, no, don't do that. So you can see here 3. And then in the blues, we went straight into the shadows and raised the blues a little bit. Because again, we wanted to get those colder tones into the shadows. Now you can see here, all of these are lots and lots of subtle changes. And what happens when you stack up lots and lots of subtle choices in the tone curve, you're gonna end up with a substantial difference. Watch this. When I turn the tone curve off, it completely changes the image and flattens it out. Versus when I turn it back on, bam, it's super epic. Watch, let's do that again. We'll turn it off. Now look, all of this editing has taken place. We've dropped our highlights, raised the shadows, raised the blacks, cut some clarity, added vibrance. We'll scroll down. All kinds of color grading took place in the HSL, as well as color grading took place in the split toning. But notice it's missing something without that pop in the tone curve. So the next time you open up an image in Lightroom and you start editing it, don't neglect to use the tone curve and make sure you're using it on purpose. Well, if you learned something today, I would really appreciate it if you liked this video. It would also help tremendously if you shared it. That's the only way this channel can grow. And if you're new, I would absolutely love it if you subscribed. Well, I'm James Young with JamesYoungPhotography.com, and this is Teach Me How to Lightroom.